My supervisor, Trevor Worthy, really loves big birds. He discovered most of the fossils and things for the giant birds in New Zealand and came to Australia to research our giant birds here. So I was lucky enough to work with him on paleognaths. So I started on the cassowary, and then we got some amazing fossils from a place called Lake Callabonna in South Australia, and it was perfect timing for the start of my PhD. And he just said, great, do you want to work on these? And I was like, yes, please. So yeah, that was kind of how it happened.
Was that something you went into for your PhD specifically, or was this something you were aware of even during your honors process? Or I guess, what was your process getting to the PhD stage and through it now?
Well, I didn't do a lot of paleontology in the lead up to my honors because I just was really kind of starting to discover what my interests were through undergrad. And it took me quite a long time to realize I was super interested in anatomy and physiology, and I wanted to direct that towards birds. And I managed to get a project for my honours working with Trevor, but on an extant species, the cassowary. And I looked at their syrinx and trachea, so that's like their breathing tube and how they vocalise. And that really started off the train for me. And then I slowly got further in time and started incorporating fossils into that project, looking at other fossil paleognaths or relatives to the cassowary. And then, did well, enjoyed that. And yeah, Trevor offered me a PhD in paleo. So that got me there, which I'm very excited about.
Would it be fair to say that this is an animal that's undergone a lot of different revisions and changes through time? It seems like a lot of stuff recently has been going on, determining behaviors, lifestyles, and more details about the anatomy of these birds.
It's been known for quite a long time, but it was on a lot of fossils and they were in pretty good condition. We got a lot of the postcranial material for Genyornis and a sort of partial, not particularly well-preserved skull. So there was good material for this bird, and that allowed people to kind of start looking into what it was related to and what it could do. But because it was giant and flightless, and in Australia where we already have emus and cassowaries, there was this assumption that they were all closely related. And that really held back research on drominithids because they were just assumed to be paleognaths. So much later down the track, when people started actually doing more complicated research into these birds and we got more species and more fossils, it was realised that they weren't paleognaths and they were placed closely to the ducks and geese, the antheriforms, as well as megapodes and chickens and things, the galliforms. So in that group of birds. And of course, then the second you have a change in who it's related to, you start getting lots of people saying, oh, well, maybe it did this as a behaviour and maybe it did that. And, they have big skulls. So this carnivorous hypothesis was put out. And yeah, it was a really interesting process thinking about how people viewed the drominithids and Genyornis over time and all the changes that occurred.
So how do you think the scientific field benefits when we make these new distinctions and we stop lumping everything in a single category, assuming that these behaviors are all going to be shared among the same animals? Like what's something that's been really exciting that's come out of this disentanglement, putting Genyornis closer to these waterfowl?
It's just been really nice to really be able to clarify better the relationships that these birds had to living taxa as well, so that we can see where they fit in the broader scheme of things. And also it has really kind of ticked a lot of boxes for all of the questions that I had when I came into the research, and I was like, this doesn't quite make sense and I'm not sure about that. And as we looked into it, we're like, oh, okay, this is why that didn't make sense, but now it does. So that's been really nice. But as we look more broadly to science, it just allows us to see how there's a lot more complexity to relationships, especially when we're looking at fossil taxa, than many might assume. And just because something's related to something doesn't mean they're doing the same thing or they look the same. You can have really quick changes in species because of environmental factors or numerous other factors that might drive them to change from, a chicken-sized animal to a 300-kilo beast in a really short period of time. And then because of that, you'd assume that they're not closely related, but they still can be. So yeah, tackling all of those challenges has been really interesting.
Would you say that it's something that you only really see here, or is it that we had large ratites and others? I'm going to mispronounce it if I try, but it starts with D and R.
Genyornis.
Yes. Are those animals that have global distributions, or do we just find them here?
So the dromornithids are only in Australia, so they're endemic to Australia. There is the chance that we might find dromornithids in the future in places like New Guinea, because other megafauna from Australia have also been found on those islands, but they haven't been discovered there yet. So we don't have any evidence of that actually being there. It's just possible. But there are giant flightless birds from a lot of other places across the world. So we have other groups like the gastornithiforms, which are from Northern Europe, North America, and even potentially throughout Asia. And they're also herbivorous. And then we have the South American carnivorous giant flightless birds, which are the forest rascals. And then we have the paleognaths as well, which are currently distributed across the entire southern hemisphere, aside from in Antarctica, but their fossils are found in Europe as well. So they had a much larger distribution initially than what there is now. So there isn't really a constraint to environment or location for the presence of giant flightless birds. But what we do see is that they don't really survive particularly well in environments where you might have a lot of larger mammals that tend to outcompete these birds. For some reason, they did manage to survive with mammals in Australia, and giant flightless birds surviving with mammals in Australia has been tentatively associated in some cases with the fact that they're marsupial animals rather than placentals. But there's still so much unknown in that region that more work could be done in.
Sorry, the carnivorous ones caught me off guard. What a horrible day to learn that. But that's fascinating. That's the only place in the world where we've observed like carnivory and giant avian theropods. Well, I guess, can we call them avian if they're not flying?
It is a very complicated thing, this term aves. And if you look into the literature, there's actually a bit of a disagreement about what to include within aves. Do you just keep the crown birds, so most of the groups that we have alive today and their close fossil relatives, or do we include everything that has the ability to fly? Or we pick these characters that we say this is what a bird is, but then you get all these morphs in the lead up to birds, which have some but don't have others. So yeah, there's a bit of a disagreement at the moment in what actually avialan means, but I think that's
really here you have a group of animals that evolved the ability to fly, and in some cases have decided, no, done with that. We're keeping the feathers, but we're done with that whole process. It feels very much to me like the evolution of seals or whales, where we've made a choice, we're going back. And my understanding is that with some of the flightless birds, you know that they're flightless because of the presence or absence of certain bones and muscle attachment sites. Is that correct?
Well, in a way. So the term ratite means it's like associated with the lack of a keel on the sternum. So that's this like massive flange of bone which all of the wing musculature attaches to on the front of on the breastbone of birds. And the larger that keel or more robust it is, generally the stronger that bird is at flying. And a lot of the flightless birds, especially ones that have been flightless for a longer period of time, have lost that structure just because they don't need that strength in their wings. And you have different levels of the extremity of these morphological changes. So dromornithids don't have a keel, but they still have these tiny little wings that stick out the side. And then you get something like the moa from New Zealand, which has also lost the keel, but it's completely lost all its wings as well. So it's lost the humerus and all other wing elements, which they're still not 100% sure why or how that happened. But yeah, it's just like we see these kind of differing responses in birds because flight is such a consuming thing to do. It consumes so much energy and you need all these structures to be able to do it. that birds are just like, well, if there's no predators around, then why would I bother doing something that's so exhausting? I might as well just walk around on the ground and use my legs a bit more. They kind of seem to really quickly, especially in groups like the rails, so small wetland birds, they just lose flight like the first chance they get. But because they do it so rapidly, we get this intermediary phase where it's like, I can fly, but I don't want to. So they're behaviorally flightless before they become morphologically flightless, so they physically can't fly.
That must be so fascinating to try and piece together from fossil evidence as well. I'm guessing you would use maybe walking tracks or other anatomical clues as to whether or not they could but didn't want to fly.
Yeah, it's a really complex process to figure out. And flightlessness is so confounding as well, because almost everything that involves flightlessness, the pectoral girdle, or like the wings and the sternum, have just been modified so heavily that you really can't use that very well in morphological phylogenetic analyses, just say because it's so confounded by this joint evolution of flight loss, which might be in completely unrelated groups of birds. And then in their hind limbs, they also generally increase the robusticity of their back legs because they're really relying on that to move and walk around. And then the morphological features in that change as well. So that's not necessarily reliable for morphological characteristics. So if we have birds that have these unreliable morphological characteristics and we don't have genetics for them, then there's really quite considerable constraints on what we can do with those birds from the fossil record.
I'm imagining if your fossil record is as incomplete as the Cretaceous fossil record, it must be a big challenge.
Well, surprisingly for Genyornis, we actually have a lot of fossils. Lake Callabonna is one of those really unusual, especially for Australia, fossil localities where these animals are walking along, they get stuck in mud, and they're covered over pretty quickly. So we actually find near complete, entirely articulated skeletons of these birds. And a lot of them will have some form of erosion through just over time environmental processes. But if we're really lucky, then we can find almost an entire individual. So that means that we can assess Genyornis from a species level, but also a population level, and then look at individuals as well, which is really nice. And their relatives, generally, we have a fairly good sample of fossils for as well. We have dromanithids at the Alcuda fossil site in the Northern Territory, and that site has produced a lot of bones from dromanithids. And they've just started producing some articulated individuals as well from that site, which is really exciting because, again, that's allowing us to look at Alcuda dromanithids from all these different levels. But we are lacking a considerable number of skull fossils for different species, which is really challenging because that isn't necessarily modified from the flightlessness, which I was talking about earlier. So we do kind of need to have these skull fossils to really be able to clarify the relationships of the dromanithids. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to get some more over time. And the first dromanithid that was described really just from a femur, and that's all that's ever been found of it. So it's one of those, up in the air kind of birds that we can't really do very much with aside from say it exists.
Yeah.